Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Civilization and Society program of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies. This is the 11th of 12 sessions which make up the Technique and Science module. The lecture will last approximately 40 minutes, during which time you should make a written note of any questions that may occur to you for clarification after the lecture. The title is Language and the Technical. The overall purpose of the Technique and Science course is to throw light on how science has developed a power, both ideological and physical, the like of which has never existed on the earth before, and which has spread over the entire globe. In keeping with this theme, today's lecture will seek to explore how this power has spread with specific reference to the sphere of language. To that end, we will look at how, through the application of scientific and technological methods, language has become a means or an instrument for the exercise of political control. The lecture will be divided into two main parts, beginning with an examination of language as an inherently human attribute. In the second part, I will focus on the manner in which this natural attribute has been subjected to the processes of scientific methodology and the resulting consequences of this technique-based appropriation of language as a fact of the European Enlightenment and subsequent scientific and or pseudo-scientific developments since that time. By way of introduction, I'll relate a personal experience that happened to me well over 20 years ago, when I had been a Muslim for less than a year. In the course of a telephone conversation I was having with another new Muslim, though a little less new than I was, the man I was speaking to, who was not an Arabic speaker by any stretch of the imagination, enthusiastically and with utter conviction asserted that Arabic was far superior to English and was the superior in every way to all of the world's other languages. Now, it was not that I necessarily had any immediate objections to this assertion. On the contrary, it was something that I had already reflected upon and thought of it as something I might one day experience personally by direct exposure to the miraculous qualities of the Quran. However, as a teacher of grammar and literature, and as an erstwhile student of theoretical and applied linguistics, I was taken aback by the untrammeled confidence of his statement, which I was sure that neither he, who had no need of evidence, nor I, in spite of, or perhaps even because of my specialized training, could have supported the position empirically, that is, in terms of the theoretical categorizations and descriptive frameworks of modern linguistic analysis. The thing that remained with me from this conversation during all the intervening years was the profound sense of irreconcilable conflict between the holistic response to language as the inseparable mediator of human experience on the one hand, and on the other hand, the subjugation of language to technical analysis and objectification, which this lecture now provides us with the opportunity to examine. So in this part we'll look at language as inherently human. In the Quran, we are reminded that amongst many other blessings, man has been gifted with 2 eyes, a tongue, and 2 lips. This reference to man's face and lips and the specific attention given to the mouth is highly significant. As far as everyday existence is concerned, the face is the focal point of our physical appearance as human beings and represents the very seat both of our individual identities and of our collective human identity. Using the latest MRI scanning techniques, neuroscientists have found confirmation that our brains are hardwired in highly specific and complex ways for facial recognition, including the interpretation and emotional response to facial expressions. One need only recall the striking scene in the cult science fiction film The Matrix, where, for refusing to cooperate with his captors, the mouth of the main protagonist is simply made to disappear, leaving behind a completely blank area of skin. The horrible sense of shock produced by the image is spontaneous and visceral. At the other end of the emotional spectrum, who can fail to be enchanted by the way in which even the youngest infants instinctively scan and respond to the faces around them, their gaze automatically drawn to the eyes and mouth, not to mention their reactions to the sound of recognizable voices. The lips are immediately visible doorways to an entire speech-producing apparatus, which ordinarily, apart from the tongue, is largely hidden and consists of lungs, trachea, larynx, pharynx, oral cavity containing hard and soft palate and the teeth. Then above there is the nasal cavity, and below the jaw. It would be an unnecessary distraction at this point to allow ourselves to become immersed in a blow-by-blow commentary on what has now become the popular spectator sport of evolutionism versus creationism, as the two positions arise out of mutually exclusive epistemological paradigms, which as such represent permanent incompatibilities, any competition or comparisons between which serve usefully only to reiterate the expanse of the gulf between these diametrically opposed views of reality. Therefore, from the point of departure of language as an inherent and inevitable human creational destiny, compatible and commensurate with man's cosmic role in the universe as the conscious locus of conjunction between the apparent but constantly vanishing nature of the empirical experience of the apparently material universe and the unseen realm of the infinite and everlasting. From this viewpoint, language emerges as man's necessary and indivisible means for contemplating, communicating, mediating, and articulating the knowledge he perceives, at least up to that point where words themselves fall short and cognizance becomes direct. But that is another matter that lies beyond the scope of today's lecture. Over the last 2 centuries, the scientific method of explanation exclusively in terms of what has now arrived at complete dominance over our way of thinking and knowing, constantly reinforced by every available means. Hence, some of you may be aware of the excited announcement made in the media earlier this week regarding the possible discovery of the key to the evolution of human speech by scientists long stumped by the enormous gap in language ability between the major primates and human beings. Reports included recordings of the gelada, a species of baboon unique to the Ethiopian highlands, whose strange call is said to share significant vocal and articulatory features with our own speech. It is not that these researches and speculations do not occasionally give rise to interesting observations or discoveries. It is simply that so long as the scientific approach relies upon the separation of the phenomena under investigation, in this case language, from the purposive, organic and holistic environment that is the proof and source of their essential meaning, and so long as it relies upon the atomistic dispersal of its subject matter in pursuit of its basic constituents at the expense of an understanding of the whole, the ultimate in useful knowledge will continue to evade such techniques. Indeed, we will come in the second part to examine the question of what this technique is actually designed to capture, as opposed to the knowledge it fails to apprehend. Here, I would also refer you to Dean Abdus-Samad Clark's excellent recent lecture, number 7, on the new physics, for a picture of how even the most advanced quantum techniques have failed to achieve the grail of objectivity that is supposed to lie at the heart of the scientific paradigm. Therefore, far from being some coincidental, fortuitous, or triumphant rearrangement of discrete and identifiable genetic and anatomical permutations winning through over countless millennia by way of natural selection, it must be understood that mankind is created and pre-equipped for language acquisition, which every normal child accomplishes with astounding readiness, including the production, perception, and understanding of speech, together with a ready capacity for mastery of its secondary representations in the form of writing and other signs, and that this capacity is confined to that creational territory reserved for mankind in his role as Allah's Khalif on the earth and the very purpose of the universe. The following key passages from the writing of Sheikh Dr. Abdul Qadir Sufi set the parameters to this perspective. He says, letters form a complete mapping of the vocal organ, the organ of speech. The letters of the alphabet are therefore placed along the organ at the points of impact where glottis contracts, tongue touches, lips move, and breath is aspired. Kafir semiotics cannot recognize the fittingness of vocal organ to letter by which speech is possible. If examined, there is absolutely nothing accidental about speech. According to the Quran, it is precisely speech which marks out man over all other creatures. We may say that every creature expresses, but there is in this articulation of man the key to his meaning. Without the biological patterning of the vocal organ, speech would not have been possible. The Quran is categoric in declaring that Allah taught Adam, primal man, all the names, or if you like, all the words. This implies that he found from within himself the capacity to decode what was outside himself. The evolutionist fiction of a simian intelligence beginning with grunt identification and moving on to complexified coding is not tenable. The evidence clearly demonstrates that the more primitive the language, the more sophisticated and complex the communications web within it. Indeed, we can now see from our present position of barbarism that language decays rather than develops. Arabic, being the oldest in the Semitic group, an ancient language, it may even be the mother tongue of the human species, but only Allah knows. Language is not, after all, a skill. It is an essential element of the total organism, for man finds that he is a speech creature. Man walking is man talking. Man knowing is man speaking. The statement, language is the house of being, will be familiar to anyone acquainted with the philosophy of the German thinker Martin Heidegger, whose political insights featured prominently in last term's course on the politics of power. In keeping with the faculty's explicit approach, which emphasizes, and I quote from our website, clear recognition of the essential advances to be gained through insights derived from the Western intellectual tradition in combination with the most penetrating of contemporary Muslim scholarship. And in keeping with that, I strongly recommend, for our present purposes, the very instructive lecture given previously in the current Technique and Science course by founder fellow Ibrahim Lawson in lecture number 6 concerning technique. It is a most useful and informative introduction to Heidegger's work. Arguably, the most significant existential philosopher of the last century, his understanding of language as the exclusive domain in which human being is inherently present to himself and to existence itself, all but converges with the Quranic understanding as expressed above. In addition to this, his preoccupation with and deep insight into the fundamental influence of the dominant technological dispensation over the affairs of humanity as a whole, and therefore, inevitably, over our relationship to language, I am left in no doubt that his contributions belong to those categories of knowledge which the Muslims are obliged by necessity and urged by tradition to seek out and to benefit from, be it in China. For example, Heidegger states, "For man is man only because he is granted the promise of language, because he is needful to language, that he may speak it." Note that the emphasis here is not on the fact of man's need for language, but rather on the realization of man's needfulness to language. That language is in need of man's speech, not on the surface level of natural language as a syntactically coherent means of communication, but because of the indissoluble bond between the pre-existing essence of language, the being of language, in relation to the meaning reality of man's destiny as its speaker. In a rather pleasing way, this brings me back to the anecdote I related at the beginning of the lecture regarding my new Muslim interlocutor's assertion of the superiority of the Arabic language over every other language, at which I was left speechless at the time, whether for or against the claim. This is because there is a meaningful parallel to be drawn here in the relationship between the pre-existent Qur'an, as preserved upon the tablet of forms, the Lawh al-Mahfuz, and the destiny of Arabic as the linguistic medium for the revelation. There can have been no greater or truer human experience with language, as intended by Heidegger, than the momentous first occurrence of the in-time convergence between the final revelation to mankind, the last and master of the messengers, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the tremendous command, recite in the name of your Lord who created. Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. As for finally bringing a belated conclusion to the persistent memory of my early conversation, I can find no more succinct way of summing it up than that offered by Sheikh Dr. Abdul Qadir al-Sufi in Indications from Signs, when he states, "The Qur'an was not made from Arabic, but rather Arabic can be seen to be made for the Qur'an. It is designed precisely to contain the message and is the perfect vehicle for it." Returning to Heidegger, his work provides us with striking indications of the survival within modern Western philosophical effort of the capacity to transcend the technical strictures of scientism in order to claim access to the inalienable opportunity to properly identify and contemplate reality that lies within the gift of language as profoundly destined for humanity, as opposed to language and thought as a methodological prison camp of the intellect. At the beginning of an essay whose subject is the way to language, the reader is advised in advance that the whole discussion could be read as a collection of scientifically untested and unverifiable propositions, but that the alternative is the possibility of experiencing something along the way by which the encounter with language is no longer as with something familiar. Whatever that something is, Heidegger's response to the question he himself rhetorically poses as to why a way to language should be needed at all, produces the following affirmation of that which we already know, but has been made doubtful. He says, according to an ancient understanding, we ourselves are after all those beings who have the ability to speak, and therefore already possess language. Nor is the ability to speak just one among man's many talents, of the same order as the others. The ability to speak is what marks man as man. This mark contains the design of his being. Man would not be man if it were denied him to speak unceasingly, from everywhere, from every which way, in many variations, and to speak in terms of an it is that most often remains unspoken. Language, in granting all this to man, is the foundation of human being. Now, not only do we see here the reiteration of the inseparability between man, his ability to speak, and the conformity of his being with that unique destiny, but crucially, we also see that something almost ineffable is being indicated that lies beyond speech itself, but which is the unnamed originating source of the it is Heidegger refers to. Muslims will have no difficulty in identifying here the kun fayakun, the be and it is, that belongs to the exclusive realm of Allah Ta'ala, the timeless echo of which remains present in all the names, or as we observed before, or all the words he taught to Sayyidina Adam. This profundity of Heidegger's insight in this connection is further indicated by the closing sentence of the quote we are reading, where the word language is deliberately invested with the capacity for agency in making the grant of speech to man. His silence or reticence on the matter of purpose or intentionality in it is easily supplied from the Quranic perspective. We should also note in the final clause that language in its granting to man is described not as the foundation of the human being, but rather of human being, which goes to the very event of man's existence, as opposed to an attribute, speech, however fundamental, of his creational form. We will take this next statement of Heidegger's as the bridge to the second part of today's lecture, which will focus upon the subjection of language to the processes of scientific methodology and the resulting consequences. He says, of late, the scientific and philosophical investigation of languages is aiming ever more resolutely at the production of what is called meta-language. Analytical philosophy, which is set on producing this super-language, is thus quite consistent when it considers itself metalinguistics. That sounds like metaphysics. Not only sounds like it, it is metaphysics. Metalinguistics is the metaphysics of the thoroughgoing technicalization of all languages into the sole operative instrument of interplanetary information. Metalanguage and Sputnik, metalinguistics and rocketry are the same. It is hardly necessary to enter into the detail of the various philosophical and linguistic trends and disciplines to which Heidegger is referring here in order to grasp his fundamental point. To be sure, In the 20th century, analytical philosophy, as associated with names such as Wittgenstein, Russell, and Frege, brought an admiration for methods associated with the natural sciences and introduced an emphasis on arriving at linguistic consistency and clarity of thought through the application of formal predicate logic and mathematical technique to the analysis of language. Prior to 20th century developments, the scientific study of language in the 19th century was dominated by an approach to research that is variously referred to as philology, historical linguistics, or diachronic linguistics, the primary focus of which was the systematic investigation of the origin of languages, the discovery and reconstruction of extinct proto-languages, and the classification of their descendants into family groupings. Therefore, the Indo-European family, which includes most European languages and those of northern India, is predicated upon the theoretical existence of a Proto-Indo-European language. Although to some extent the example of classical physics, as opposed to quantum physics, took the lead in the study of sound changes, the scientific movement within philology tended to take the majority of its impetus from the biological rather than the mathematical. Hence, the determination to see languages as organic objects to be described objectively, and the overriding influence of Darwinian evolutionary theory over the direction of linguistic research and the interpretation of evidence. The scientific emphasis in the study of language which gave rise to what we know as linguistics was almost exclusively the preserve of German scholars, including Wilhelm von Humboldt, 1767 to 1835, who is noted as being the first in Europe to approach language as a system governed by rules. Also, there was Jakob Grimm, 1785 to 1863, of the Brothers Grimm, after whom Grimm's Law, describing Proto-Germanic consonant shift, is named. Franz Bopp, 1791 to 1867, whose Lautgesetz, or sound law, offered a mechanical explanation for the alternation of vowels in morphological paradigms such as sing, sang, sung in English. August Schleicher, 1821 to 1868, who produced the Stammbaum, or family tree theory of language evolution, in immediate response to Darwin's Origin of the Species. We also have August von Schlegel, 1767 to 1845, who is credited with the three-way classification of languages into isolating, agglutinating, and inflecting as ideal types. And worthy of mention is the Dane Erasmus Rask, 1787 to 1832, who was not only actually the first to state Grimm's Law, but he also mastered at least 25 languages and dialects in the course of his investigations, and his grave, unsurprisingly, carries inscriptions in Arabic, Old Norse, and Sanskrit. Of course, none of these tendencies towards the scientific paradigm could have been the case if not for the advent of the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment in Europe. And this we looked at last term in lecture number 2, the European context, as part of the Politics of Power module, where we find the following powerful summary of the Enlightenment's purpose and impact by the contemporary philosopher A.C. Grayling, who says, recognizing the aspiration that change of authority from religion to science is the key to understanding the Enlightenment, informed in its very essence by the idea that the spirit of science should be extended into all domains. That was what the Enlightenment was, an enlargement of the scientific approach, to put it at its most general, the empirically controlled, responsible, non-dogmatic exercise of reason to wider domains of concern. Major examples of its consequences to speak again in general terms, are all the revolutions of the 18th century. Our concern here, of course, is how that spirit of science has been extended into the realm of language. The Enlightenment took its main impetus from the Renaissance, which occurs more or less between the 13th and 17th centuries. Through a fascinating series of essays gathered under the title Vernacular Values by the philosopher, academic and radical social commentator Ivan Illich, 1926 to 2002, we are provided with a dramatic view of how in 1492 the scholar and grammarian Antonio de Nebrija, 1441 to 1522, petitions Queen Isabella to support his project for the deliberate and systematic displacement of vernacular language by means of the professional formulation and imposition of abstract grammatical rules and the compilation of dictionaries, through which gradual process Illich identifies the coming of the market-intensive society in which we now live. The following passage paints a stunning picture. Nebrija frankly states what he wants, and even provides the outline of his incredible project. He deliberately turns the mate of empire, language, into its slave. Here, the first modern language expert advises the crown on the way to make, out of people's speech and lives, tools that befit the state and its pursuits. Nebrija's grammar is conceived by him as a pillar of the nation-state. Through it, the state is seen from its very beginning as an aggressively productive agency. The new state takes from people the words on which they subsist and transforms them into standardized language which henceforth they are compelled to use, each one at the level of education that has been institutionally imputed to him. Henceforth, people will have to rely on the language they receive from above, rather than to develop a tongue in common with one another. The switch from the vernacular to an officially taught mother tongue is perhaps the most significant, and therefore least researched event in the coming of a commodity-intensive society. The radical change from the vernacular to taught language foreshadows the switch from breast to bottle, from subsistence to welfare, from production for use to production for market, from expectations divided between state and church to a world where the church is marginal, religion is privatized, and the state assumes the maternal functions heretofore claimed only by the church. Formerly, there had been no salvation outside the church. Now, there would be no reading, no writing, if possible, no speaking, outside the educational sphere. People would have to be reborn out of the monarch's womb and be nourished at her breast. Both the citizen of the modern state and his state-provided language come into being for the first time. Both are without precedent anywhere in history. To continue then, the period from the mid-16th to the mid-17th century marks the age of the scientific revolution and the early modern age. The personalities associated with it have become iconic. Nicolaus Copernicus is the bridge from the Renaissance and is followed by the likes of Galileo Galilei, Johannes Kepler, René Descartes, Isaac Newton, Gottfried Leibniz, and Francis Bacon. For a fuller account of the creation of modern science, I strongly recommend Dean Abdulsamad Clark's lecture number 2 of the present module, The Rise of Science. By the time we come to the 20th century onwards, the shift away from the historical or philological orientation of the previous century is complete, and the biological paradigm, which equated language with an organic species, had been abandoned due to a lack of convincing data, and biology itself had become the poorer relation with respect to the mathematical and physical sciences. What we have witnessed instead is the rise of what has been called synchronic linguistics, which focuses upon the task of describing as a complete system the abstract entities we think of as languages that underlie the living utterances that people actually make every day. It is the description of language as a present social fact. This was the departure initiated by Ferdinand de Saussure, 1857 to 1913, who, although considered the father of 20th century linguistics, having postulated the new ontological question for linguistic theory to attempt to answer, various theoretical approaches and models have since entered the stage. It is beyond both the scope and purpose of today's lecture to conduct a comprehensive survey of these developments, especially given the immense extension and proliferation of different grammatical theories and new disciplines such as sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, neurolinguistics, applied linguistics, discourse analysis, language acquisition, etc. Major schools include the descriptivists, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the Prague School of Functional Linguistics, generative grammar, generative phonology, and relational grammar, to name a few of the most influential ones. At the core of linguistics is the study of language structure, or grammar, which is understood to comprise at least 5 principal subfields: phonology, dealing with sounds; morphology, with the form of words; syntax, which is sentences; semantics, which deals with meaning; and pragmatics, which is meaning in context. By far the most influential single grammatical development of modern times is the generative theory first proposed by Noam Chomsky, born in 1928, in his seminal work Syntactic Structures of 1957, which is generally acknowledged amongst linguists to have been revolutionary. In essence, his theory proposes the existence of syntactic universals at a deep structural level within the brain or mind, capable of generating the surface structures which represent the familiar forms of any human language. His highly mathematical approach to the description of how these structures operate, and the highly complex hierarchical schematic diagrams required to visualize the role of each theoretical constituent, are not intelligible to the lay reader. However, what they do project most graphically is an opening up and an ordering of language to forms of manipulation or exploitation hitherto possible only in the realms of science fiction. Subsequent elaborations of this approach and its extension to related cognitive and other fields of investigation and application have in very little time, accelerated by the enormous advances made in the increased capacity of microprocessors, presented us with technological marvels such as speech synthesis or machine speech, natural language processing, electronic voice recognition, machine translation, and human experimentation with methods such as neuro-linguistic programming. At this point, we must return to Heidegger for the key to understanding the way in which scientific method has commandeered through man, including man himself, the resources of the entire planet as a store of available material, or what he called a standing reserve. Man is gathered by an enveloping technological enframing, a Gestell, and so is called in all of his actions, perceptions, and language to the fulfillment of that way. Because framing challenges man, that is, provokes him, and this is Heidegger, he says, because framing challenges man, that is, provokes him to order and set up all that is present being as technical inventory, all ordering finds itself channeled into calculative thinking and therefore speaks the language of framing. Speaking is challenged to correspond in every respect to framing, in which all present beings can be commandeered. Within framing, speaking turns into information. It informs itself about itself in order to safeguard its own procedures by information theories. Framing, the nature of modern technology holding sway in all directions, commandeers for its purposes a formalized language, the kind of communication which informs man uniformly, that is, gives him the form in which he is fitted into the technological calculative universe and gradually abandons natural language. As indicated in the first part of this lecture, it is my conviction that the way of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the last and only universally accessible way forward with freedom. That brings us to the end of today's lecture. The further reading will accompany the notes to the lecture. Next week is our final lecture of the module and will consist of an overall conclusion to the course. Thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum.